If you haven't heard of it, and I wouldn't blame you if you hadn't, Evoland is a game that takes the player through the history of the RPG and adventure genres, starting with the days of the NES through the early PlayStation. It was created by Nicholas Canas in August 2012 and released on Steam in April 2013, and it is so close to being good. There were 3 gameplay styles during the game: your Zelda-inspired adventure levels from a top-down perspective, RPG take-turn fights reminiscent of Final Fantasy 6 and 7, and one area that contains Diablo-style dungeon crawling. It's got all the staples of the adventure and RPG genres: collectibles, optional upgrades, hidden areas, even a card game as a callback to the side games that populate Final Fantasy titles. You get to name the main characters, in my case Shrek and Donkey, and the execution, from gameplay to graphics to the soundtrack, is technically spot on. So what exactly is it missing? For me, the problems start popping up in the second half of the game. The first half I actually found pretty enjoyable. Although it's far from challenging, watching the game world rapidly evolve as you collect graphical upgrades and such is more than nostalgic. It's actually intriguing, and a really well thought out interactive history of games. The problem, however, surfaces once you've gotten most of the upgrades. By the time you get the final visual upgrades that turn the game into a Final Fantasy VII lookalike, the game is essentially done evolving. And without evolution, Evoland struggles to find its own identity as a game and not just a technical exercise. It has a lot of threads open and a lot of paths to take, but it never really commits to any of them and just winds up being underwhelming. Let me explain in greater detail. The Zelda levels are the most frequent, with 3 dungeons and 2 forest maps that function like a top-down adventure game. Along with Shrek's Buster Sword, we also get 2 of Link's most iconic items, the bomb and the bow. Now, it's a limited inventory for sure, but for a game that only lasts a few hours, it hardly gets stale. The issue isn't the tools you have to solve puzzles, it's the puzzles themselves. They do a lot of the classic Zelda puzzles, with disappearing floors, block pushing, blocked doors, even a Dark Link-style boss that you have to defeat by outsmarting him. Now, the boss fight is actually one of the highlights of the game, but the rest of the setup is just sort of bland. For example, most of the block pushing puzzles entail nothing more than pushing the block onto a button that is exactly behind the block. There's no misdirection or challenge to it at all, and even though Zelda games themselves have been struggling to find new ways to make block pushing tricky, the Evoland puzzles make it seem like the developer didn't really care to try. It's sort of a "remember when Zelda did this?" feeling, and that's just not enough to carry the gameplay. Now, when you solve a puzzle in a Zelda game, it's rewarding, either because you get a new toy to play with, or simply because you had finally tackled a difficult obstacle. But with the simple floor-light puzzles and fire dodging in Evoland, it seems like the puzzles are just there. There's no real challenge, and it feels more like a slowly paced obstacle course. The one exception to this are the dimensional shift stones that come later in the game. They send Shrek and the game world from the 3-dimensional future to the 2-dimensional past. There are some clever puzzles involving burning trees in the past to get past them in the future, and stepping over obstacles in the future that are insurmountable to the 2-dimensional Shrek of the past, who has no concept of height. Now, there are a few moments when you have to fire the bow through torches to burn trees from a distance, but unfortunately, even these clever puzzles are mostly laid out in a linear fashion, so that you basically solve them by just continuing to move forward, and shooting what clearly needs to be shot. The other major style of play is the turn-based RPG combat system brought over from Final Fantasy 6 and 7. Although Evoland starts out heavily Zelda-based, the game's design ultimately settles on a Final Fantasy 7 aesthetic, with pre-rendered backgrounds, a soundtrack with an uncanny resemblance to the Squaresoft classic, and the entire plot. There's even an airship, owned by a Sid character who you're allowed to name, although he never actually joins your party despite there clearly being room for one more fighter in the combat screen. Actually, the combat is really where the Final Fantasy homages fall apart. The combat is incredibly stripped down and basic, and you'll really just find yourself hammering the attack button as Shrek. There's no real weapon or armor system, as you just purchase the upgrade equipment in the shop and it automatically applies itself. And of course, there's no materia or anything to speak of. This is a short game after all, and I totally get why they didn't find any of that necessary. There's still an issue with the balancing, however. When Donkey joins the party, she has a very weak attack, but a free healing spell that heals both of your characters, obviously making her the healer, which is pretty cool. It doesn't take long, however, for her to get her only other spell in the game, X Crystal, an attack that will do just as much as Shrek's attack. With there being no MP in the game whatsoever, you can just use this or heal every turn, so Donkey sorta just really starts outclassing Shrek in every way. Donkey doesn't last forever, though. After all, this plot heavily emulates Final Fantasy VII, so Donkey winds up being the heiress of the game and gets slaughtered by the villain, affectionately called Zephyros. Once this happens, the take-turn combat effectively loses what little value it had. Here's what happens. Shrek gets Donkey's heal spell, as well as the ability to summon Bahamut, which is basically a screen-clearing attack that takes time to recharge. You never get another character, even though there's room for 3, so you're just stuck with this one character who does everything. This makes the random battles even more of a chore than they were before. But you know what? I dealt with it. I ground, whatever, to raise my levels so I wouldn't get my ass kicked by the final boss. Guess what? The final boss is done entirely in Zelda style. There's no required turn-based fights after the first fight with Sephiroth. It's nice that you have the airship so you don't have to walk on the ground, but if you want to explore at all, you're constantly going to be harassed by weak enemies. The only tough one is the Chocobo, who you kill for a side quest, and he's only difficult in that he takes more than one hit to kill. Random take-turn battles are not inherently fun. In Final Fantasy, Pokemon, and other RPGs, random battles are bearable because, no matter how annoying they are, they're at least leading up to that final challenge. It's part of your struggle. In Evoland, they're completely useless. They serve absolutely no purpose after the first Sephiroth fight, and that makes them nothing more but a pointless obstacle. Now, you may notice a common issue with both of these gameplay segments. They're both hollow. The puzzle segments require a little thinking, and the stat-based combat doesn't build to any sort of climax or sense of accomplishment. So if the gameplay itself isn't the backbone of the game, what is? Evoland sells itself as a parody of adventure games. This is all well and good, except it's not all that funny. The actual storyline itself is an insanely bland retelling of a few Final Fantasy elements, and the end is incredibly bland. Not only is Sephiroth's defeat not impressive, it's not funny either. It just happens, and the game ends. The rest of that game leading up to that point is sparse in jokes as well. Not only are there a few jokes in the first place, the jokes that are there are extremely lackluster. Things like, man, don't you hate when games do this? Or slight fourth wall breaking nods that are just sort of facts, not really jokes. There is one part of the game that I do find really funny, and that's the hack and slash segment. While the gameplay is as repetitive as you'd expect from a Diablo clone, it takes something else common in the genre, the item drops and equipment, and lampoons the hell out of it. You get all sorts of nonsensical items with effects that are just hilarious. I think this is the only time in the game I was trying to complete something for more than just the easy Steam achievement. Outside of this though, there's really no humor or any other personality to push the game along and keep you engaged. You just spend most of the game watching things happen, and very little happens. So what about the collectibles? There are 30 stars to collect hidden in treasure chests all over the game world. When you collect them all, you get a Steam achievement. That's it. Alright, so how about the double twin cards? 23 total, and they let you play a minigame. Cool, right? The game's actually not awful, really. It's just a little short. A round takes maybe a minute, and once you beat a handful of levels, you've cleared it. It's kind of funny that you don't get to build your own deck, but instead get randomly assorted 5 cards that you own. So, if you want to ensure that you win, just look up the locations of the good cards and just grab the ones you want. Although honestly, I never lost a game and only came close to losing once. Oh yeah, you get an achievement. Next is a handful of things to find. There are 3 hidden locations, and once you get the airship, it shouldn't be hard to find them. They'll be the only places on the tiny map that you haven't already gone to. Now, while there's not a whole lot in the way of bonus content, it's actually some of the better content in the game. It's where the most complicated puzzles are, at least. Overall, Evoland lacks direction. It's not really funny, it's not really challenging, it's not really compelling. If it wasn't so short, it took me 4 hours to 100% it according to Steam, I wouldn't have finished it. It's definitely at its strongest during the beginning, when you see the world changing rapidly around you, and during the Diablo segment where the laughs are constant. It ultimately suffers from a lack of purpose in the end. You can design a game to reflect successful games, but a player can only do so many soulless Zelda puzzles before he starts asking why. You know, little references like naming the main characters Clink and Karis are cute, but comedy is unforgiving, and the humor would have to stay much more consistent to carry the game. To the developer's credit, Evoland was made in 30 hours for a festival. With that in mind, it's impressive what he pulled off. That doesn't fix any of the problems though, and as a game released on Steam, it feels unfinished. Like he sorta just gave up after the first half. The presentation of the evolving world in the beginning is fantastic, however, and I would love to see Knass dig into a well-thought-out game with a full team of talented designers. It isn't a bad game, really, it's just sort of underwhelming and had a lot of missed potential. It's not very expensive, so if it sounds like something you want to check out, yeah, go ahead and pick it up. I'm really curious to see what this guy's going to come out with next.